The moment I stepped through the ballroom doors, more than 200 Navy SEALs and military officers rose to their feet so fast that the scrape of chairs across polished marble sounded like a burst of gunfire. Conversations died instantly. Champagne glasses froze halfway to waiting lips. A commander standing near the entrance straightened his back and shouted with enough force to shake the crystal chandeliers hanging above the reception floor. "Admiral on deck." Then came silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence that makes people suddenly aware of their own heartbeat. My mother's face drained of color. My younger sister, Rachel, stood motionless beside her wedding cake, one hand still wrapped around her bouquet. And my father, the same man who had texted me less than 24 hours earlier telling me that nobody cared about my Navy career, looked at me as though he were seeing a stranger. I wish I could tell you that moment felt satisfying. For more than 30 years, I had imagined some version of it. A moment when the people who dismissed me would finally understand who I had become. But standing there in my white dress uniform with 4 silver stars on my shoulders, all I really felt was tired. Tired enough to understand that revenge rarely arrives the way people imagine. The strange thing about humiliation is that it grows older with you. I was 58 years old, standing in a luxury ballroom overlooking Charleston Harbor. Yet part of me still felt like the skinny 17-year-old girl sitting at my parents' dinner table while my father praised my younger sister and criticized me for being difficult. Rachel could do no wrong. She was beautiful, popular, graceful, the kind of daughter parents proudly showed off. I was the daughter who asked too many questions. The daughter who talked about aircraft carriers instead of weddings. The daughter who wanted a military career instead of a predictable life. Back in 1985, Rachel laughed. My mother looked confused, and my father slowly folded his newspaper before staring at me as though I had embarrassed him. "You'll grow out of this phase." That's what he said. A phase. As though serving my country was some teenage hobby. But I never grew out of it. If anything, the Navy became the first place in my life where people stopped asking me to become smaller. At Annapolis, nobody cared whether I smiled enough. Nobody cared whether I fit into anyone's idea of what a woman should be. They cared whether I could lead, whether I could stay calm under pressure, whether I could make hard decisions when lives depended on them. As it turned out, I could. The years passed quickly. 1 deployment became 2. 2 became 10. Then 20. I commanded ships. I led task forces. I made decisions that affected thousands of sailors. I spent years operating in places most Americans only saw on the evening news. Yet every time I returned home, I somehow became that same awkward daughter again. The daughter who made everyone uncomfortable. The daughter whose achievements were politely ignored. I remember one Thanksgiving when a neighbor congratulated me on a promotion. Before I could answer, my father smiled and said, "Oh, Claire just works for the government. Just works for the government." At the time, I was already commanding thousands of personnel. But after a while, disappointment becomes routine. You stop correcting people. You stop explaining. You stop expecting anything different. Over the years, phone calls became shorter. Birthdays were forgotten. Family gatherings happened without me because I was deployed overseas. Rachel got married, divorced, started a business, closed a business, started another one. I learned most of it through relatives. Not because my family hated me, but because they never seemed to know what to do with me. 3 days before Rachel's wedding, I was sitting inside my office at Naval Station Norfolk, reviewing retirement paperwork when my phone buzzed. The message was from my father. I almost ignored it. We hadn't had a real conversation in months. Instead, I opened it. 1 sentence. No greeting, no explanation. "No one cares about your Navy career. Please don't embarrass us by wearing that uniform to Rachel's wedding." I stared at the screen for a long time. Outside my office window, Atlantic rain hammered the pier. Young sailors hurried between buildings with collars raised against the wind. Life continued as normal, but something inside me felt strangely hollow. Not angry, not surprised, just tired. After all those years, my father still believed my service was something embarrassing, something attention-seeking, something that needed to be hidden. I placed the phone face down on my desk. Then I laughed once. A quiet laugh. Because by that point, I had spent more than 3 decades making life and death decisions. And somehow a text message from an 80-year-old man still had the power to hurt me more than enemy threats ever had. That evening I sat alone in my townhouse overlooking the water. A glass of bourbon rested beside me. The house was silent. No husband. No children. No family photographs covering the walls. Somewhere along the way, life had become almost entirely about service. My marriage had ended years earlier. David used to tell me the Navy always came first. At the time, I argued with him. Now I wasn't so sure. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't family. It was Michael Hayes, a retired SEAL commander and one of the finest men I had ever worked beside. The moment I answered, he got straight to the point. "Tell me you're still going to Charleston." I smiled despite myself. News travels fast. Half the East Coast military community is attending that wedding. Of course it does. I leaned back in my chair. I'm thinking maybe I should stay home. Silence filled the line. Then Michael spoke. "You spent 30 years showing up when people needed you." His voice softened. "Don't start hiding now." I closed my eyes. The words hit harder than I expected. Because Michael had seen parts of my life nobody else had. He had seen casualty reports, funeral notifications, the aftermath of impossible decisions. If he thought I should go, maybe I needed to listen. "You really think it matters?" I asked. "No," he answered. "I think you matter." I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I opened the garment bag hanging in my closet. Inside was my full white dress uniform. The gold buttons gleamed. The ribbons sat perfectly aligned. 4 silver stars rested on the shoulders. I ran my hand slowly across the fabric. People often think uniforms make you feel powerful. Sometimes they simply remind you how much they cost. By noon, I was driving south toward Charleston. The highway stretched endlessly beneath gray Carolina skies. Old jazz played softly through the speakers, and somewhere along that long drive, I had no idea that within 48 hours, everything my family believed about me was about to change forever. Charleston welcomed me with golden evening sunlight reflecting across the harbor. It was the kind of city that looked as though it belonged on a postcard. Historic buildings lined the waterfront. Massive oak trees draped with Spanish moss swayed gently in the coastal breeze. Sailboats floated peacefully against the horizon. Most people would have found it beautiful. All I felt was tension. The wedding venue sat directly beside the water, a sprawling estate surrounded by white columns, manicured gardens, and strings of lights hanging from century-old trees. Luxury cars filled the entrance. Valets hurried between arriving guests. Laughter drifted through the warm afternoon air. I checked into my hotel quietly and kept mostly to myself. That night, just as I was standing by the window overlooking Charleston Harbor, my phone rang. My mother. I answered immediately. "Hi, Mom." For several seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then she finally spoke. "Please try not to upset your father tomorrow." That was it. No welcome. No question about my trip. No mention of how long it had been since we'd seen each other. Just concern for my father's feelings. I stared out at the dark water after she hung up. Somewhere beyond the harbor, Navy vessels were moving through the Atlantic night. For the first time in years, I admitted something I normally kept buried. No matter how successful I became, part of me still wanted my parents to be proud of me. The next morning, military habit took over. I woke before sunrise, worked out, reviewed my schedule, pressed my uniform one final time. By noon, I was driving toward the venue. The ceremony wasn't scheduled for another hour, but old military habits die hard. 15 minutes early had been considered late for most of my career. As I stepped out of the car, the salty Charleston air wrapped around me. A young valet approached. The moment he noticed the 4 stars on my shoulders, his posture changed immediately. "Good afternoon, ma'am." I handed him my keys. "Thank you." His reaction wasn't unusual. Military personnel notice details most civilians miss, but the wedding guests walking around the property barely looked at me. To them, I was simply another woman attending a wedding. Perhaps someone involved in a military ceremony. Perhaps nothing important at all. Honestly, I preferred it that way. I followed the stone pathway toward the ceremony lawn. And then I saw my mother. She was standing near one of the reception tents, wearing a pale blue dress and the pearl necklace that had belonged to my grandmother. The moment she spotted me, her smile appeared. but it never quite reached her eyes. Oh, Claire. Her gaze moved slowly from my shoes to the silver stars on my shoulders. You really wore it. I glanced down at my uniform. Yes, Mom. She stepped closer and lowered her voice. It's Rachel's day. There it was. The same message I'd heard my entire life. I kept my tone calm. I know. She hesitated. People might misunderstand. I nearly laughed. People had misunderstood women in uniform for decades. Before I could answer, another voice interrupted. You actually did it. My father, Harold Bennett, 80 years old, former football coach, former local hero, former authority figure of our family. His shoulders had begun to stoop with age, but his voice still carried the same edge I remembered from childhood. His eyes locked onto my uniform. His jaw tightened. You couldn't let Rachel have one day. I blinked. Good to see you too, Dad. He ignored the comment. You know exactly what you're doing. The accusation landed harder than I expected, because the truth was exactly the opposite. For years, I had done everything possible not to make my family uncomfortable. I rarely discussed promotions. I avoided talking about military operations. I changed subjects whenever people asked about my career. I made myself smaller every chance I got, and somehow it was still too much. My father stepped closer. You could have worn a normal dress. Normal. That word again. The same word I'd heard growing up. Why can't you be normal? Why can't you settle down? Why can't you stop trying to prove something? Before I could respond, another voice interrupted. Claire. Rachel. She looked beautiful. The kind of beautiful that belonged on magazine covers. For a brief moment, I saw the little girl who used to follow me around the backyard when we were children. She hugged me warmly. I'm glad you came. I wouldn't miss it. She smiled. Then, hesitation appeared on her face. Can I ask you something? Of course. She looked away for a moment, then back at me. Would you maybe consider removing some of the medals before the reception? I stared at her. The medals? She nodded quickly. They just attract attention. For several seconds, I said nothing. I looked down at the decorations on my chest. Each one represented years of sacrifice, deployments, losses, successes, lives saved, friends buried, entire chapters of my life. Rachel immediately looked uncomfortable. I'm not trying to be rude. I know, and I did know, she wasn't trying to hurt me. But the message remained exactly the same. Shrink yourself. Just a little more. The ceremony began shortly afterward. Guests filled rows of white chairs overlooking the harbor. A string quartet played softly beneath the oak trees. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and summer flowers. It was beautiful, and I was genuinely happy for Rachel. She deserved happiness. Whatever complicated history existed between us, she deserved this day. After the ceremony ended, everyone moved toward the ballroom for the reception. I deliberately chose a small table near the back corner, far away from the family, far away from attention. At least that was the plan. A few minutes later, a gray-haired man stopped in the middle of the ballroom and stared directly at me. Then another. Then another. Whispers began spreading quietly through the crowd. At first, I assumed they simply recognized the uniform. But then an older retired captain approached. His eyes widened. Admiral Bennett? I smiled politely. Captain Reynolds. The man's posture straightened instantly. It has been years, ma'am. Nearby guests overheard the exchange. Heads started turning. Within minutes, more former military personnel began recognizing me. Some approached to shake my hand. Others simply nodded respectfully from across the room. A retired Marine colonel placed his hand over his heart before returning to his seat. The atmosphere was beginning to change. And across the ballroom, I noticed my father watching everything. Confused. Uneasy. Almost nervous. Because for the first time in his life, he was seeing complete strangers show me a level of respect he had never imagined. And this was only the beginning. The real shock was still coming. The ballroom looked like something out of a high-end magazine. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. Champagne flowed freely. A jazz band played near the dance floor. Guests laughed beneath warm, golden lights while servers moved between tables carrying silver trays. I sat quietly at my table near the back of the room. Exactly where I wanted to be. Invisible. Or at least as invisible as a 4-star admiral could be. For a few minutes, everything felt normal. Then a young Navy lieutenant approached. He looked nervous, fresh-faced, probably no older than 25. He stopped beside my table and stood a little straighter. "Excuse me, ma'am," I smiled politely. "Yes, Lieutenant?" His expression immediately brightened. "I just wanted to say it's an honor to meet you." "Thank you." He shifted slightly. "My father served under your command in Afghanistan." That caught my attention. "What's his name?" "Senior Chief Robert Mercer." The name instantly sounded familiar. I leaned back slightly. "Mercer survived the Kandahar evacuation." The lieutenant nodded. "Yes, ma'am." His voice softened. "Our family never forgot what you did." For a moment, I wasn't in Charleston anymore. I was back in Afghanistan. Dust. Heat. Chaos. Helicopters. Casualty reports. Young men praying to get home alive. I remembered Mercer. I remembered the operation. I remembered how close we came to losing half that convoy. The lieutenant swallowed hard. "My dad still talks about you." I smiled. "Your father did his job." The young officer shook his head. "No, Mom. You brought them home." Before I could answer, another voice interrupted. Then another. Another officer approached. A retired Marine. A former Navy commander. A defense contractor who had once worked with the Pentagon. Within minutes, a small crowd had formed around my table. Across the ballroom, guests began noticing. The whispers grew louder. "Who is she? Why are all these military people talking to her? What's going on?" I could practically see the questions moving through the room. And then everything changed. Near the ballroom entrance stood a retired SEAL commander named Nathan Holloway. The last time I'd seen Nathan was nearly 15 years earlier after an operation overseas. His hair was grayer now, his face older, but his eyes were exactly the same. Sharp, alert, professional. He was talking with a group of former operators when his gaze landed on me. He froze. For a moment, he simply stared. Then he immediately straightened. The expression on his face changed completely. Every person around him noticed. The nearby SEALs turned. Then more people turned. Within seconds, a ripple moved through the military guests scattered around the ballroom. Recognition. The kind that spreads fast. Very fast. Nathan took one step forward. Then another. His posture became rigid, professional, respectful. The room slowly began growing quieter. At first, nobody understood why. Then chairs started moving. 1, 3, 10, 20. Suddenly, the sound exploded across the ballroom. Hundreds of chairs scraping marble floors at the same time. The noise was impossible to ignore. Conversations died instantly. The band stopped playing in the middle of a song. Champagne glass froze in midair. Every civilian guest turned toward the disturbance. I felt my stomach tighten, because I already knew what was happening. Nathan stepped forward. His voice thundered through the ballroom. "Admiral on deck." The command echoed off the walls. Every military guest immediately rose to attention. Current officers, retired officers, SEALs, Marines, sailors, defense personnel. More than 200 people standing at once. The room fell completely silent. I slowly stood. Not because protocol required it, but because there was no other choice. For one surreal moment, my two worlds collided. The daughter who was never enough, and the admiral who had spent decades leading sailors across the globe. Nathan saluted. Others followed. Rows and rows of military personnel. The sight was overwhelming. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am?" A faint smile crossed my face. "You never needed permission before, Nathan." Laughter rippled through the military crowd. The tension eased slightly. Nathan grinned. Still true. Then he turned toward the guests, many of whom were staring in complete confusion. "You folks probably don't know this." His voice carried easily across the ballroom. "But Admiral Claire Bennett is one of the finest leaders I've ever served under." The room remained silent. Nathan continued. "She brought people home when everyone else thought it couldn't be done." A retired SEAL stepped forward. "Damn right she did." Another voice came from the crowd. "Saved our entire unit." Another. "She stayed with my family after we lost my brother." Another. "She wrote every single casualty letter herself." One by one they stepped forward, each carrying a story, a memory, a debt, a moment they had never forgotten. An older chief petty officer approached slowly. He walked with a noticeable limp. I recognized him immediately. Marcus Dean, one of the hardest men I'd ever known. His eyes looked wet. "Mom? Marcus?" He nodded, then turned toward the room. "Most commanders send paperwork." His voice cracked. "After Red River, she sat with my wife for 6 hours. The ballroom was completely silent now. Even the servers had stopped moving." Marcus pointed toward me. "My son still has a father because of decisions she made." A woman near the front wiped away tears. Several guests exchanged stunned looks. The stories continued, one after another, each one revealing another piece of a life my family had never bothered to understand. And then I looked toward the head table. My mother's hand covered her mouth. Rachel looked overwhelmed. But my father looked pale, truly pale, like a man whose entire understanding of reality had just cracked. Because for the first time in his life, he was seeing what everyone else already knew. He wasn't looking at a daughter who worked for the government. He was looking at a leader respected by warriors. And the biggest shock of all was still seconds away. Because at that moment, Ethan's father rose from his seat and began walking toward me. And when one of the most powerful defense executives in America publicly revealed who I really was, the entire wedding would change forever. Richard Whitmore was not the kind of man people ignored. Even among the wealthy guests filling the ballroom, he stood out immediately. Former Vice Admiral, founder of one of the largest defense technology firms in the country. A man whose company held contracts worth billions of dollars. And perhaps most importantly that evening, he was Ethan's father, Rachel's future father-in-law. As Richard moved through the crowd toward me, people instinctively stepped aside. The conversations that had only just started recovering fell silent again. When he finally stopped in front of me, he smiled warmly and extended his hand. "Admiral Bennett." I shook it. "Richard." He laughed softly. "I had absolutely no idea Rachel was your sister. That makes 2 of us." A few nearby guests chuckled. But Richard wasn't finished. Not even close. He turned toward the ballroom and slowly raised his glass. The room immediately quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen," every eye shifted toward him. "I think many of you are wondering why half the military community in this room suddenly forgot there was a wedding happening." Laughter spread through the crowd. Richard smiled. "Allow me to explain." Then he gestured toward me. "You're looking at Admiral Claire Bennett." The room remained silent. Most civilians still had no idea what that truly meant, Richard continued. "Over the past 20 years, Admiral Bennett has led some of the most important military operations this country has conducted." Whispers immediately began spreading. He wasn't exaggerating, but hearing someone else say it out loud felt deeply uncomfortable. Richard ignored my expression and continued. "She has commanded thousands of sailors, directed multinational operations, led evacuation missions that saved countless American lives, received some of the highest honors available in military service." More whispers. More stunned expressions. A woman near the front visibly gasped. A businessman at another table slowly lowered his wine glass. And then Richard delivered the sentence that changed everything. "In my professional opinion, Admiral Bennett is one of the finest military leaders of her generation." The ballroom erupted into applause. Not polite applause. Real applause. Sincere applause. The kind that comes from genuine admiration. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I smiled politely and waited for it to end. Across the room, my eyes found my father. His expression was impossible to describe. Shock, confusion, disbelief, regret, all mixed together. For decades, he had introduced me as someone who worked for the government. Now, strangers were standing and applauding a career he had barely acknowledged. One by one, more people approached. A retired senator, a former ambassador, several senior military officers. Each brought another story, another memory, another achievement, another piece of a life my family had never bothered to ask about. At one point, a senator in his 70s shook my hand firmly. "Washington still talks about your Gulf evacuation strategy." I smiled politely. "That was a team effort." He laughed. "That's exactly why it worked." The senator moved on. My father remained silent. Several minutes later, he finally spoke. "You planned military evacuations?" I looked at him. "Yes. He blinked. Thousands of people? Sometimes. Silence followed. For the first time in my life, my father genuinely seemed unable to find words. The man who always had an opinion suddenly had none. Dinner continued. The band resumed playing. Guests returned to their conversations. But the atmosphere had changed permanently. Now people approached our table constantly. Military officers, business executives, politicians, veterans, parents of service members. Every few minutes someone stopped to thank me, and every single time, my father listened. Quietly, painfully, carefully. Listening to strangers describe parts of my life he had never wanted to hear. Around 9 o'clock, the noise became overwhelming. I excused myself and slipped outside. The harbor welcomed me with cool evening air. Moonlight shimmered across dark water. The distant lights of boats reflected against the marina. For the first time all evening, I could breathe. I leaned against the railing and stared toward the Atlantic. A familiar voice interrupted the silence. Mind if I join you? I turned. Rachel. Still wearing her wedding dress. Still carrying the same uncertain expression she'd worn all day. I smiled slightly. Of course. She stepped beside me. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The sound of water gently hitting the docks filled the silence. Finally, she exhaled. I owe you an apology. I looked at her. For what? Rachel laughed softly. Probably several decades. I didn't answer. She stared out at the harbor. When I asked you to remove your medals, her voice weakened. I was wrong. I remained quiet. She continued. It wasn't really about the medals. I know. The wind pushed a loose strand of hair across her face. She brushed it aside. You know something awful? What? Rachel looked down. I spent most of my life believing Mom and Dad loved me more because I was somehow better than you. I said nothing. Tonight, I realized how ridiculous that sounds. The honesty caught me off guard. Rachel laughed sadly. I always thought you were the difficult one. I raised an eyebrow. I was. No. She shook her head. You were the brave one. The words hit harder than I expected. Because they were the last words I ever expected to hear from my sister. For years, our relationship had been defined by comparison, competition, distance, misunderstanding. Now, standing beside the harbor, none of that seemed important anymore. Rachel turned toward me. Her eyes glistened under the moonlight. I should have been proud of you. Emotion tightened in my chest. It's okay. No? She shook her head firmly. It's not. A tear slipped down her cheek. I should have said it years ago. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she smiled. A genuine smile. The kind I hadn't seen from her since childhood. I'm proud of you now. For the first time in decades, I believed her. And for the first time in decades, the distance between us felt smaller. But before either of us could say anything else, another figure appeared near the ballroom entrance. My mother. Her eyes were red, her mascara slightly smudged, and judging by the expression on her face, she had something she had been carrying for a very long time. Something neither Rachel nor I knew. Something that was about to change everything I believed about the last 30 years. My mother stood near the ballroom doors for several seconds before slowly walking toward us. The harbor wind moved gently through her silver hair. For the first time all evening, she looked vulnerable. Not like the woman who had spent decades trying to keep peace inside our family. Not like the mother who always seemed to know exactly what to say. Just a tired woman carrying years of unspoken regret. Rachel glanced between us. I'll give you 2 a minute. She squeezed my arm gently before walking back toward the reception. Then it was just my mother and me. The sound of distant music drifted from the ballroom. Somewhere inside, guests were laughing. Glasses clinked. Life continued. But out there beside the marina, time felt strangely still. My mother stopped beside me and stared out across the dark water. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she finally broke the silence. I owe you an apology. I looked at her. The words didn't surprise me. The sadness in her voice did. She swallowed hard. I think I chose the easier daughter. For a moment I wasn't sure I had heard correctly. What do you mean? She let out a slow breath. Rachel always needed something. Advice. Support. Encouragement. Her eyes filled with tears. And you. She paused. You always seemed strong. A small laugh escaped me. Strong people still need their mothers. Her face crumpled immediately. I know. The words came out barely above a whisper. I know that now. Silence settled between us again. The harbor lights reflected across the water like scattered stars. My mother wiped at her eyes. Then she surprised me. You know, I used to save every newspaper article about you. I frowned. What? She nodded. Everyone. I stared at her. For a second, I genuinely thought she was joking. But she wasn't. They're all at home. She looked down at her hands. In a dresser drawer. I didn't know what to say. All those years, all those promotions, all those ceremonies, all those achievements. And somehow she had been following everything. Quietly. Without ever telling me. I kept every clipping. Her voice shook. Every magazine article. Every television interview. A lump formed in my throat. Why? She laughed softly through tears. Because I was proud of you. The words hit harder than I expected. For years, I had convinced myself my parents simply didn't care. Now I wasn't so sure. Before I could respond, another voice interrupted. Barbara. My father. He stood several yards away near the marina entrance. His expression was different. Gone was the defensiveness. Gone was the frustration. Gone was the stubborn certainty he had carried his entire life. Now he simply looked tired. My mother touched my arm gently. Then she walked back toward the ballroom, leaving us alone. My father approached slowly. The harbor breeze moved through his thinning silver hair. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he surprised me completely. I was drafted in 1967. I turned toward him. What? He nodded. I never told you. No. A bitter smile crossed his face. There are a lot of things I never told you. He stared out at the water. My father made a few phone calls. I listened quietly. He knew people. His jaw tightened. Important people. The realization came slowly. My grandfather had helped him avoid Vietnam. My father continued staring into the darkness. I told everyone I had a medical issue. His voice sounded distant. But the truth is, he swallowed. I was healthy. I didn't interrupt. I spent years pretending I was lucky. His eyes remained fixed on the harbor. Then my friends started coming home in coffins. Pain entered his voice. Raw pain. The kind that survives decades. My best friend died outside Da Nang. He laughed once. A hollow sound. I stood at his funeral and listened to everyone call him a hero. The silence that followed felt heavy. And all I could think was, he stopped. His voice broke. That should have been me. Everything suddenly made sense. The resentment. The discomfort. The way he always minimized military service. The way he dismissed my achievements. It had never truly been about me. It was about shame. A lifetime of shame. My father leaned against the railing. For the first time in my life, he looked small. Human. Fragile. I spent 40 years trying not to think about Vietnam. His eyes glistened. Then my daughter joined the Navy. He laughed bitterly. And became everything I was too afraid to become. I stared at him, unable to speak. I thought if I minimized your success. He paused. Maybe I wouldn't have to think about my own failures. The honesty hurt. Not because it was cruel. Because it was true. The harbor fell silent around us. Only the gentle sound of water remained. Then my father turned toward me. For the first time all evening, he looked directly into my eyes. Claire. His voice trembled. I was proud of you. Emotion tightened inside my chest. Was? A weak smile appeared on his face. I am proud of you. The words arrived 30 years late. But they arrived. And somehow that mattered. You had a strange way of showing it. He nodded immediately. I know. A long silence followed. Then he laughed softly. When you left for Annapolis, I told everyone you'd quit. I smiled. I remember. But every time you proved me wrong, his smile widened slightly. I secretly bragged about you. I stared at him. What? Oh, absolutely. He chuckled. I kept every article too. That surprised me more than anything else. My father shook his head. I just never knew how to tell you. The ballroom lights glowed behind us. The wedding was slowly coming to an end. Guests were beginning to leave. Cars lined up outside. Music faded. And standing beside that harbor, I realized something. Families aren't destroyed by a lack of love. They're destroyed by a lack of honesty. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Old habits. The harbor outside my hotel window glowed gold beneath the early morning light. After checking out, I walked through the front doors carrying my luggage. My father was waiting. Beside him sat a worn cardboard box. He handed it to me awkwardly. "Your mother wanted you to have these." I opened it. Letters. Dozens of letters. Every letter I had mailed home during my years at Annapolis. Every single one. My hands trembled. "They kept these?" My father nodded. "I read them last night." He reached into the box and carefully removed one envelope. His eyes filled with emotion. There was one line I couldn't stop thinking about. He handed it to me. I recognized my own handwriting immediately. 18 years old. Homesick. Hopeful. Desperate to be understood. The sentence stared back at me. I hope someday Dad will finally be proud of me. My father swallowed hard. Tears filled his eyes. I was proud the whole time. His voice cracked. I just didn't know how to say it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then something inside me finally let go. Not the memories. Not the pain. Just the weight. The weight I'd carried for decades. A few minutes later, Rachel arrived carrying coffee. My mother followed behind her. We stood together beneath the Carolina morning sun. Not perfect. Not healed overnight. But finally honest. As I drove north toward Norfolk, Charleston slowly disappeared in my rearview mirror. And somewhere along that highway, I realized something important. The greatest achievement of my life wasn't becoming an admiral. It wasn't the medals. It wasn't the commands. It wasn't the recognition. It was learning that my worth never depended on someone else's approval. Not even my family's. A few hours later, I stopped at a small airport cafe. While waiting for coffee, a young Navy recruit recognized me. Her eyes widened. "Admiral Bennett?" I smiled. "That's me." She stood a little straighter, a little prouder, a little more confident. And for the first time in years, the future felt lighter than the past.